Tonight's Torah portion is ha'azinu, which means to give ear, to listen, to pay attention. Tonight's Torah portion is Deuteronomy chapter 32, 1 to 52. The entire chapter is one chapter. It is a song, effectively a song. The last 3 or 4 verses are the conclusion of the chapter. So God wanted Israel to hear his song. It's not Moses' song, it's God's song. When the children of Israel left Goshen and crossed over the Sea of Reeds, they sang a song, and this was Moses' song. He sang this song. God didn't give that song to Moses. With this song, God gave Moses this song. So the lyrics belong to God. Let's look at that in Deuteronomy chapter 31. I think we read this last week, verse 19. God speaking to Moses on behalf of Israel, he says, "Now therefore, write this song for yourself and teach it to the sons of Israel. Put it on their lips, so that this song may be a witness for me against the sons of Israel." So the song is a witness, a testimony against the sons of Israel on behalf of God. So it's God's song, not Moses' song. Moses' responsibility was simply to sing the song for them, give it to them so that it will be upon their lips. I talked a little bit about this song last week. It's sort of a dismal song, like I said last week. It's truthful. It's straight to the point type song, very much like God. But it's a little bit dismal. It speaks concerning the sin of Israel and the engagement of unrighteousness that Israel would get involved in. It speaks in the future tense. That here is what Israel would actually do. And it's a dreadful thing to think about it that way, that God knew that Israel would enter into the most terrible types of transgressions, which they certainly did. So most of the song is an indictment. God's bringing an indictment against Israel. An indictment against their unrighteousness and what will ultimately happen to them as a result of that. But the song is not without hope. Not without really, really incredible nuggets of hope and restoration. So let's talk about this song a little bit. Let's consider the song that God gave to Moses, God's song. Again, this is Abba's, the Holy One's song, and he gave it to Moses. We can say that he entrusted it to Moses so that Moses will give it to the children of Israel. So, in this song, let's keep in mind, first of all, that Israel had a charge to lead the nations, right? We know that. It was given to Israel to be a leader of the nations. God said earlier in the message of Moses that, now also keep in mind, and always keep in mind, that the book of Deuteronomy is effectively one message. An entire message. All of the chapters is one message. So Moses got up this particular day, began to preach, and he didn't stop until he sang the song. What did he do after the singing of the song? Well, he went on to bless the tribes of Israel. And that was it. What was Israel to do once his work was done on this particular day? He was to die. And so he had a big day. What do you think? Get up and preach the book of Deuteronomy, sing this song for Israel, bless the tribes of Israel, then you die. He had a big day. He had a day of all days. And I think that he would have went up to Mount Nebo completely fulfilled as a man. What do you think? The only thing that Moses probably regretted was his unrighteousness in that he acted unfaithfully against God, and he struck the rock at Meribah. Struck the rock instead of him obeying God, he struck the rock and he could not enter into the land, and that would have been Moses' only real regret at that time. He said as much. So Israel is to lead the nations. That's going to reflect in this song here. God doesn't put a lot of emphasis on it because the majority of the song is for an indictment. But let's read here where God reminds Israel, or in this song, that Israel has a charge concerning leading the nations. We're going to read verse 8 and verse 9 of chapter 32 of Deuteronomy. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, Nakalah, so when God himself, the Most High God, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, or the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, I've tried to understand. Now, most Bible commentators don't have a lot to say about that statement. And that probably means that they don't quite understand what it's saying. But I have a certain understanding that I want to share with you. I might be wrong, I might be right. Let's read verse 9. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. There's that word again, inheritance, Nakalah. Nakalah is a very rich Hebrew word. It's used a lot in the land of Israel today because the Israelites today, they see the land as their inheritance. They see God as their inheritance. But there's also the reality that the land and the people are in fact God's inheritance. That God himself has an inheritance, and that inheritance is the land and the people consummated. And that's where we are today. Not fully consummated. There's still many Jews outside of the land of Israel, but their numbers are decreasing rapidly. Praise God for that. So, let's get back to verse 8. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. And what does that mean? It tells me, and some Bibles would say the tribes instead of the nations, and so on, but they all agree that God will number the nations according to the sons of Israel. Now, from my understanding, the best I can discern, it's talking about Israel's charge. God given Israel a charge over all the nations. In other words, the nations are under the responsibility of Israel. Israel has responsibility for the nations. And that's why God said to Israel earlier that you will be the head and not the tail. You will lead the nations and not follow the nations. Right? And so when you think of a head, think of an animal. The head goes first. The tail follows. Right? So the nations are to follow Israel. Now, in this context, being a head is being a servant. The head of a family, what are his responsibilities? To show the way, to be a guide, to be a light to the family. The family is to follow the head. So Israel is the head of the nations. God referred to Israel as his firstborn. And that's very vivid in Exodus. He referred to Israel as his firstborn. Now, why firstborn? Because Israel is destined to be a lead to the nations. That's sort of the purpose of a firstborn child. He is to set the example. He's to set that example of obedience to Abba. And Israel is that firstborn, to lead the nations. So I think the reference there is about Israel's position, responsibility in leading the nations. Now, how well has that happened in the last 3,500 years of the history of Israel? They had moments of glimmer, right? They had moments of light. They had moments of shining. But by and large, they failed miserably, actually. And God said they would because of their sin, because of their tendency towards idolatry, which if you read Deuteronomy carefully, you would see that God wasn't taken by surprise at all. He knew what Israel would do. He knew what the penalty for Israel's idolatry would ultimately be, and he was prepared to exact it. He was prepared to carry it out. It was necessary for God to chastise Israel in the way that he did. You know, in Jeremiah chapter 25, there's an incredible verse where God says that judgment will begin in Jerusalem. That all the nations will be rendered judgment. All of the nations would be judged. But it begins with his people and his land and his city. Why? Because they are the head. So he's going to set the example by being faithful to his word concerning judgment against rebellion. He did it with Israel first. And from Israel, judgment spans out into the nations. So God is faithful to his word. He said he would bring this judgment upon Israel, and he does. But the nations are under the charge of Israel. Now, what we've seen in the last 60, 70 years since the establishment of the State of Israel is that Israel is on the cusp, on the verge of taking more and more responsibility over the nations. It's happening. I would venture to say as time goes on and more Jews decide to leave the diaspora and make Aliyah and return to the land of Israel, we will see a stronger and stronger movement towards Israel becoming big brother to the nations. It's going to happen. It's already happening. You can see the traits of a leader arising in the midst of Israel, can't you? Can't you? You can see it. It's very clear. You can see the reality of a big brother taking his position in the midst of Israel. And in time to come, we'll see it more and more. So this is a wonderful time for rejoicing. But let's move on. So in this same song, God made mention of the fact that Israel will grow fat. What does it mean to grow fat? The reference there is it pertains to a cattle, perhaps a bull or cow that's well fed. And let's read the reference. I think, yes, 32 verse 15. Let's read that. But Jeshurun is another name or another word for Israel, a name for Israel. Jeshurun means upright, the righteous. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. What is the reference here to kicking? Rebellion. If you've ever milked a cow, you know that you don't want that animal to kick, right? If you've tried to harness an animal, you don't want that animal to kick. And so Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You are grown fat, thick and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scorned the rock of his salvation. This is an indictment against Israel again. So Israel became powerful, became strong. They were sleek. You look at a cow that's well kept, well fed. She's sleek. There's a shine on her coat, isn't it? And this is Israel. This is what happened with Israel. But she was in rebellion against her maker, God. God goes on in the song. He says he's going to vindicate his people. Let's read that in chapter 32 again, same chapter 34 to 36. He's going to vindicate his people. Now we're at a place in this revelation, in the revelation of this song, where God is turning his face away from the unrighteousness of Israel, and he's turning his face towards the unrighteousness of the nations. You see? And that's the pattern. In the prophets, we see the same pattern. That God will speak concerning chastisement against his people Israel, and then almost invariably, he will turn his focus away from Israel and to the nations. And so here, he's turning his face away from Israel and to the nations. So obviously, we're entering into a time, because the song is effectively a timeline. If you look at the song, if you analyze the song, it is effectively a prophetic timeline. So in this timeline, we're coming to a point, when God is going to speak judgment or bring judgment against the nation. So, is it not laid up in store with me? In other words, is it not prepared? He's speaking of judgment. Sealed up in my treasuries, vengeance is mine, and retribution. In due time their foot will slip, for the day of their calamity is near, and the impending things are hastening upon them. Who is he referring to? We're going to discover that he's referring to the nations. For the Lord will vindicate his people and will have compassion upon his servants. Yes, he will. When he sees that their strength is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. So God will bring retribution upon the enemies of Israel, his enemies, when he prepares to vindicate them and to bring compassion to his servants. So I've always said, and this is a fact, and I teach it in Zema quite a bit, when we see the restoration of Israel, what follows almost immediately is his vindication against those who oppressed his people, judgment. So restoration of Israel is followed by judgment upon the nations in just about every prophetic case. All right, so here we see now the song in this timeline is beginning to turn away from chastisement towards Israel and retribution, vindication on behalf of Israel. Verse 43 of the song. Jim O'Brien read this verse in Hebrew. I read it also last week. Verse 43 is the conclusion of this incredible song. Rejoice, O nations, with his people. And for he will avenge the blood of his servants and will render vengeance for his adversaries and will atone for his land and his people. Now again, you've heard me say it so many times that the land of Israel, the people of Israel, are God's inheritance, his Nachalah. He's going to atone. He's going to pay for his inheritance. That's how he ends the song. That's his conclusion. He's going to pay for his Nachalah, his inheritance, but he wants the nations to rejoice. Rejoice with what he have done. What has he done? He has redeemed his people Israel. He has avenged the blood of his bondservants. He's going to render vengeance, but he wants the nations, and I would say this, in this timeline, it ends right at the beginning of the millennial kingdom. That's what I believe. So the song begins, perhaps, in this timeline that the song represents. The song perhaps begins at Kadesh Barnea, or maybe at Sinai, or maybe at the moment that they come into the land. We don't know. But it ends at the beginning of the millennial kingdom when redemption is complete for that 1,000 years. That's the ending of it. And that's why he's calling for the nations to rejoice. Which nations? The ones that are left. The nations that are left after this great battle, the Armageddon, the battle of Armageddon, the battle of Jezreel, that humanity is about to face. After this great battle, there will be nations that are left. We'll see that again tonight. And these are the nations that God will call upon to rejoice with his people. Now you're saying, wait a minute, what does any of this have to do with Sukkot? He said he was going to teach on the festivals. Let me say this. Verse 43 is all about Sukkot. It's all about Sukkot. It's all about the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'll tie it together for us. Now, so you have a time when the nations are going to rejoice with the people of Israel because of what God has done. What did he do? He brought retribution upon his people. He saved his people. He redeemed them. He revisited them with compassion and mercy. We understand that God is preparing to restore Israel. The prophets are all very clear. God is going to restore Israel. So the song ends when Israel is restored, vengeance is carried out, the wrath of God is exacted upon the nations who came against his people. In other words, Matthew chapter 25, the judgment seat of Christ is accomplished. The nations are judged. Those that remain, those are the ones we're going to focus on. By the way, we're not included in those who remain because we're no longer a part of the nations. When Jesus comes, I will forego my American citizenship because instantly I am now a citizen of the kingdom of God. And so we will not be included in the nations. We will be the bride of Christ. We will reign with him. We will no longer be the Goyim, the nations. All right? That's exciting. I'm not sure about you, but to me that's very exciting. So Ezekiel now saw this time when the nations will reckon with God's redemption, the redemption of his people, the redemption of his city, the redemption of his land. Remember, the land and the people are redeemed together because the land and the people are God's inheritance. Ezekiel saw this with his eyes, his spiritual eyes, and he reported that for us in Ezekiel chapter 37. So let's go to Ezekiel chapter 37. So what I'm saying to you is what we just read in Deuteronomy chapter 32, 43, that timeline that we talked about came to an end when God once again is dwelling in the midst of his people, and Israel is lifted up as a nation. and the nations are rejoicing with what he has done. Ezekiel saw the same thing, but much more involved. And so let's read what Ezekiel saw in Ezekiel chapter 37, 24 to 28. Now keep in mind, let me ask this question, another rhetorical question. Who is David prophetically? Who does David represent in a prophetic context? The son of David, right? King David, the son of David, Jesus. Jesus. All right, so Jesus is the representation of David. He's the son of David. Remember that blind man that called out to him? He was going through a crowd of people, and everyone was pressing in on him. And he just wanted to get from point A to point B. But then there was a blind man that said, you son of David, help me. And he stopped. He stopped. Why? Because he acknowledged that this person knew him prophetically as the son of David, the Ben David, the promised son of David, Moshiach, Messiah Ben David, son of David. And so he stopped and he ministered, acknowledging and making the statement that, yes, I am the son of David. So let's read this now. My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. Speaking here of Israel, of course, because Ezekiel chapter 37 is all about the restoration of Israel. It is 100% about the restoration of Israel. There's not a Christian in this world that can appropriate these verses to themselves. Not one. Well, can do it effectively anyway. So this is about Israel. My servant David will be king over them, who? Israel, and they will all have one shepherd, and they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them, keep his law. And they will live on the land that I gave to Jacob, my servant, in which your forefathers lived, and they will live on it, they and their sons sons, forever. And David, Jesus, my servant, will be their prince forever. Will be their prince forever, and I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will place them and multiply them. This is the favor returning to Israel, the restoration return to Israel. And here we go, my sukkah, my tabernacle, my booth, my sanctuary, my temple, they're all related. My sanctuary, when I set my sanctuary in their midst, for how long? For a short period of time. Forever. It's an eternal blessing. It is an eternal placement of God's tabernacle. So God's going to put his tabernacle in the midst of Israel when King David, son of David, King Jesus, the Prince of Israel, is reigning as a shepherd in the midst of Israel. My dwelling place also will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Now listen up. And the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. So Moses saw the nations rejoicing with what God will do with Israel. Ezekiel sees a little more. Ezekiel sees his sanctuary, his sukkah, his tabernacle being placed squarely in the midst of Israel, in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel is noting here that the nations will behold what God has done, and they will know. What does it say? Let's read it again. And the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. So the sanctuary, the sukkah, God's dwelling place, his sukkah in the midst of Israel, is a sanctifying agent to Israel. And the nations will see it, and they will rejoice with him. They're not going to stand in rebellion against him, at least for 1,000 years, when he places his sanctuary in their midst. They will rejoice with him. Now, this is about Sukkot. Because when Jesus comes to reign with his church, his tabernacle, because the church is the living tabernacle, isn't it? His dwelling place. You see, because it says here, my sanctuary, and then it goes on to say, when also my dwelling place will be with them. So there's going to be a literal, physical sanctuary, but there's also going to be his dwelling place. which is the living tabernacle. So consider, if you would, you have this building. You can say that this building, in effect, is a sukkah, a house, a tent, a tabernacle, a covering. Yes, you can say that. But when we come together, we become his dwelling place. And that's why there's a distinction in these verses concerning his sanctuary and his dwelling place, because we are actually the dwelling place of God. God dwells in us. And so in the age to come, in the millennium to come, there's going to be a literal physical sukkah, building, temple, sanctuary, booth, however you want to refer to it. It's there, it's physical, it's real, it's made of stone, it's made of metal, wood, whatever. But then there's the living temple where God dwells in the midst of that. And that's the mystery concerning the tabernacle. All right, that's the reality of God dwelling in his tabernacle, because God, the Father himself, is going to dwell in Jesus for 1,000 years in this tabernacle, in this dwelling place. And we are the fabric of the tabernacle. We are the fabric of the sukkah. You follow me? God moves in when his Son completes the building of the sukkah. God has commissioned that his Son will build for himself a sukkah, a tabernacle, a booth. And when it's complete, and God is right and ready to celebrate a millennia of Sukkot, he's going to move into his sukkah. And it's for this reason, James, the pastor of the first century church, the bishop of the first century church, recognized the church as the house of David, or the booth of David. He did. He said to the disciples that were bickering over the law, no law, or whatever, he said, don't you know that this is the tabernacle of David, referring to the church. So the church is the tabernacle of David. The nations will come up to Jerusalem, and we'll see this here in a few moments. The nations will come up to Jerusalem from year to year to honor God in his tabernacle, in his sukkah, and that will happen for 1,000 years. And we are that dwelling place. We are. All right, so let me say this. Someone decides that they're going to build a sukkah. They start off with a frame, like this. And then, that's the first thing you do. So you have the structure, but then you've got to bring it to life. Right? You have the frame. You run wires around it or whatever, rope or something that you can put your living members on. But this is just dead wood. This is not the sukkah. You see, this is like a building, right? It's dead stone, dead wood. It's not alive. And then, for the sukkah to be alive and for it to come to its fullness, he's got to go out and pick for himself evergreens that will stay green for at least 7 days. 7, God's number of completion. Perfection. It is done. And so he goes out and he picks evergreens. He selects them. And he covers his sukkah with greenery. And when it's all done, it is a place of life. It is a dwelling place of life, made of dead wood. But when you see it, what do you see? It's green. It's overflowing with life. And this is the case for 7 days. You see, this is the picture. This is the allegorical picture of the millennial kingdom. God's going to have Israel build for him a tabernacle. He's going to have Israel build for him the structure. And he's going to bring the greenery. His Son will bring the greenery. His Son right now collecting the greenery. Each one of us, you represent that evergreen. He's picking us. He's out in the forest and he's picking what he knows will last 7 days, and he's preparing to decorate Father's sukkah. That's the essence of Sukkot. A living tabernacle, a living sukkah. When Abba moves in, what does he do? He dwells there temporarily. At the end of the millennial kingdom, he brings his own permanent dwelling, which is the New Jerusalem. Perfect in every way. But you see, the sukkah that God gave to Israel to build with temporary evergreens, a symbolic picture of the living tabernacle. And this is what Ezekiel is seeing here. A frame, a structure, a sanctuary, a place where we can meet, because this is a sanctuary, right? I'm going to belabor this one more time. This is a sanctuary. We built the sanctuary. Many of us, our hands did the work, hung the doors and did all that stuff, put down the base. We built this sanctuary, but we didn't build the dwelling place of God. Who built the dwelling place of God? Well, Jesus did. He went out into the forest and picked evergreens, and so here we are. We're alive, and every time we assemble, we're a picture of God's sukkah, and he comes in and he dwells in us. That's the reality. That's the mystery that Paul spoke about in Ephesians, in Corinthians. Mystery, that this happens. God dwells in us. Messiah in us, the hope of glory. God dwells in us. So Ezekiel is reporting that when this happens, the nations will know that it is the God of Israel who sanctifies Israel. When his tabernacle, when his dwelling place, sanctuary and dwelling place, is in their midst forever. You see that? It's beautiful. Now, Zechariah now will report to us that during the millennial kingdom, the time of Sukkot, the 7th millennia, right? The Sukkot millennia, when God is temporarily dwelling in the earth in his tabernacle. That's what Sukkot is all about, 7 days of it. Zechariah reports to us that during this time, the nations will come up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles every year in Jerusalem. You see, back in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43, that's what was being painted. That picture was being painted, that the nations will rejoice with God when God would place his tabernacle in the midst of Jerusalem and he will dwell with them. The nations will come up to Jerusalem every year to celebrate God's dwelling in the earth. And in Zechariah chapter 14, I want to read for you verse 16. You all know it. Let's read it anyway. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations, again, that's an important reference. Any who are left after what? Any who are left after Armageddon, after the great battle that's portrayed in Zechariah chapter 12 and 13. Because if you back up a little bit from this chapter into 12 and 13, you see that it's referring to Armageddon. Armageddon happens. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4, Jesus comes. And now verse 16, God gives us the pattern of life during the millennial kingdom after the nations have been judged, after the lake of fire has been opened, and the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire, after Satan is arrested and cast into the abyss. This is post-Armageddon. The nations, those who are left after that judgment period, will come up to Jerusalem. Let's read it. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will come up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. That's incredible, isn't it? Any of the nations, all of the nations, in fact, any meaning all of the nations who are left, who came up against Jerusalem, he's referring to chapter 12, will come up to Jerusalem. They will celebrate. They will celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. They will celebrate the Feast of Booths. Every year in Jerusalem, people from all over the world, it's been happening now for about 40, 45 years. Since 1967, it started slowly and it built into what it is now. Every year, thousands of people from the nations will go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Some people are a little bit misguided in believing that they're fulfilling this. And perhaps it's true, but only in an allegorical sense. Because this is literal. This will literally happen. There's nothing allegorical or symbolic about this. The nations will literally go up to literal Jerusalem, literally one a year, to literally celebrate the Feast of Literal Tabernacles. You follow me? Literal tabernacles, because there's going to be a literal tabernacle, a living tabernacle, placed squarely in the midst of Jerusalem, and God's Son will be glorified in it, and so will you. You will be the evergreen. You would not be green, you'd probably be shining bright, but you will be the evergreen of that particular tabernacle. God has already picked me. He's already cut me off. Cut me off from what? Well, cut me off from the forest of this world. Hopelessness. I'm a cut off branch, being prepared to be smacked onto the tabernacle. In fact, every time we come together, it's a picture to the world and to the principalities that this is God's sukkah. We make a statement to all of the principalities every time we come together, and I want to draw reference to the importance of the assembly. Every time we come together, we're speaking to the principalities, and we're saying, here is God's tabernacle. God is dwelling here. And this will happen for 1,000 years while you are in the pit. The abyss, for that 1,000 years, this is what we're going to be doing. That's why Satan hates this. That's why Satan wars against worship. That's why many of us, we struggle to worship, because it makes a prophetic statement that the demons hate. The demons hate it. They can't stand it. Because of the statement it makes, the prophetic noise that they hear is, God's going to cast you and your master into the pit for 1,000 years, while there's a living tabernacle in Jerusalem, and these people are going to be living members of that tabernacle while you're in that pit for 1,000 years. We need to keep making this statement. Yes. We need to keep making this statement. This statement needs to be louder and louder, don't you think? What do you think? Yes. Needs to be louder and louder. Amen? Now, I won't chase any rabbits, because there are no rabbits that's worth me being here until 10 o'clock tonight. It's already 10 o'clock. Last week we saw that every 7 years, Israel were to celebrate a grand Sukkot. Every 7 years, we saw that, right? Did we read that? Yes. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 31. Deuteronomy chapter 31, an astonishing verse that said that Israel were to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in a very special way every 7 years, that had to do with the remission of debt. Let's read that again. Let's read it again. Chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, verse 9 to 12. So Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the time of the year of remission of debts, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all of Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place which he will choose, you shall read this law in front of all Israel in their hearing. The assembly of the people, the men and the women and the children and the alien who is in your town, so that they may hear and learn the fear of the Lord your God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law. Isn't that something? Every 7 years, God is commanding Israel here to have a special Sukkot, when everyone comes, not just the men, right? Because the regular Sukkot, like Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, normally the men will go up to Jerusalem, not everyone. In this case, everyone, even the alien, even the sojourner and the alien, is to come up every 7 years. The number 7 is important. This is pointing to the millennial kingdom, where for 142 times this will be celebrated. The 7th year Sukkot, where everyone will come up and debts will be cleared. Could you imagine that? Could you picture that? That during the millennial kingdom, every 7 years, there's a special Sukkot where everyone's debt will be cleared. Everyone. Not just in the nation of Israel, but throughout the world at that time. So that tells us what? There will be commerce during that period. during the millennial kingdom. There will be commerce. Commerce is not a bad thing. Not even capitalism. Capitalism is not a bad thing. Free market is wonderful. Free market is going to exist during the millennial kingdom. But in God's kingdom, under his system of economics, every 7 years, whatever your debt is, it is cleared. That's part of the millennial system. And every 7 years there's going to be a very special Feast of Booths where the nations will come up and celebrate and rejoice before God. Again, they're coming up to rejoice concerning what God has done with his people Israel, and also with the fact that Israel has become big brother to the nations. Israel has become big brother to the nations where they're leading the nations. And every Sukkot, every 7 year Sukkot, the law will be taught. To whom? To the nations. By whom? By Israel. Also by us. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of God from Jerusalem. The word law there is Torah. The word Torah is teachings. So who's going to do the teachings? In the kingdom of God, who has responsibility for teaching? The priests. The priest has responsibility for teaching the law of God. That's what you will be doing. You see, because you will be the priest. Israel, the nation of Israel, is also a priestly nation. That's what God said to Israel in Exodus. You are a nation of priests. But you see, how is that going to happen? The law will go forth, the teaching will go forth from Zion, from us. We will have the principal responsibility of teaching. It will come through Israel. It will come through the priestly nation. It's God's system. But think about how wonderful Sukkot is. Think about how much God upholds his festivals. That even in the redemption, after he brings down this horrible world system that's taken shape in the world, that's preparing to lift its fist against God, God's going to crush that. He's going to send his son, and we with him, and we're going to put an end to that kingdom. And as a result of that, he will set up 142 special Sukkot celebrations and 1,000 celebrations of Sukkot. What do you think about his other festivals? Do you think perhaps he's going to celebrate his other festivals as well? We are? Well, of course. So Sukkot, folks, it's much more than meets the eye. It's not just building a frame and putting living members of a tree or trees onto it. It's pointing to what God will do in Jerusalem. He will place his living temple, who you are. He will place you there, and you will become the vessel of God. You will become God's dwelling place. And that's what the Sukkah points to. On Sunday, we'll talk about the tabernacle of David and how that is a picture of who we are. Again, when the debate came up about law, about circumcision, about what believers, Gentile believers, were commanded to do. This is the debate of Acts chapter 15. James brought an end to the debate. He brought it to a close by simply saying, this is the tabernacle of David. He basically said, don't mess with the tabernacle of David. Because the legalistic Jews, the legalistic Christian Jews, were messing with the tabernacle of David. They were fooling around with believers, saying that you must be circumcised, and you must obey the law. Otherwise, you can't be a part of this. And Peter and Paul made powerful arguments. They said, "Why are you compelling them to do what we ourselves couldn't do?" It's a strong argument. And Peter and Paul won the argument, and James went along with it and said, "Okay, this is the tabernacle of David. Don't strain the tabernacle of David. God is raising it up, the fallen tabernacle of David that God had risen at that point." So the tabernacle of David, Sunday, we're going to talk about it. It's a place of freedom. It's a place of no constraints. It's a place of just worship between King David, Jesus in this case, and God himself. And then there's the fabric of the tabernacle, which is what you represent. You represent the fabric. So, praise God. So, Sukkot. I want this to settle in you. I want you to embrace this. The real significance of Sukkot. Now, sometimes people get caught up in religiosity, and they begin to do religious things because that's what other people do. And sometimes, many times, most times, those religious things are effectively meaningless. There's no depth of meaning to them. So when you decide to build your sukkah at home, if you're going to do that, understand what it represents. Understand the powerful significance of it. I'm going to go about to pick some greenery for that sukkah that's in the back. And with every greenery that I pick, I'm thinking about the church of God. I'm thinking about the believers in Messiah Jesus that are being called out to be a part of the living temple. You know, the Greek word for church is ecclesia, right? You've heard that before. If you're Spanish, you've heard the word iglesia. Well, it comes from the Greek word ecclesia. The word ecclesia has a lot to do with Sukkot. A lot. Because the word ecclesia means, it's a composite word, two words in one. Ech, meaning to, and it's not guttural, ech, meaning to be cut off. Ek, in Greek, means to be severed away from, to be taken away from. And the word ecclesia means to be called. So when you put those two words together for the word ecclesia, church, you're cut off and you're called, appointed. That's Come next week, I'm going to be cutting off some branches. I'm going to be cutting off some branches, and I'm going to be, they're called, and I'm going to attach them to the living tabernacle, the living sukkah that we have out back. So God has cut you off from the world. Now, I can preach on this for a few hours. God has cut you off from the world. You've got to be cut off. You've got to allow yourselves to be cut off. You've got to leave the world behind you because you've been cut off and you've been called to something much greater than anything the world can offer you. What can the world offer you, really? Better than a living sukkah for 1,000 years, God's habitation. What can the world possibly offer you that's better than that? That's greater than that? Consider teaching God's law in Zion to all the nations. Consider ministering to the nations that are left after Armageddon and lifting them up and explaining to them the reality of who God is, His mercy, His goodness, His wonder. You'll give that up for the world? He's sought you out. He's called you. He has chosen you. He has cut you off. And He's brought you into His sukkah. Just be a part of it. Just fit in. Just make sure that your leaves are shining. Make sure that your leaves are green and you're shining nice and bright. Shabbat Shalom.